talked about last week. We agreed to continue these discussions. We wanted to focus this meeting on a presentation from some experts on the arsenal, some historical perspective on the arsenal, some technical, if you will, perspective on what's there, relative, and what any believed risks might be due to the activities, the oil and gas activities that are anticipated in the city relative to actions that have taken place on the arsenal. And sort of paraphrasing there, but obviously we have Charlie Sharman from the arsenal here who will present on that, on those themes in general. If we find that there are questions outside of the areas that he's presented, then obviously we'll, within limits, go off script a little bit there. We'll then plan to spend the remainder of the meeting setting our agenda for the next series of sessions. One of the things that I wanted to talk about before we get underway today is the concept of membership to this committee or participation in this committee. We've had some requests, obviously, from the citizens to add a fourth seat today. We've had some level of standing in for others on the committee. As in any committee, commission, board, or other body that somebody might sit on, the importance is that we have a consistency of participation. So the same people here as frequently as we can, a defined number of participants who are functioning alternates. So to that end, council authorized the body to function in that manner, and I need to ask that we try and do our best in that regard. It makes it less likely that we're going to retrace areas that we've traced previously. It also limits confusion when we see the faces coming in the room. We're not sure why folks are here. So I understand the intentions of the committee, I believe, on having the individual in question here today. I would look at that as not a member of the community, but a request to have somebody present from a participation perspective in an ad hoc fashion, external expert, whatever the case might be. So any comments, questions, or otherwise sort of in that vein?
I have one. I don't mind having a couple more residents for it because we've had different folks from the industry come in and they have been consistent as well. And it's just different opinion. And it helps because this is such a huge topic that we need to make sure we cover, cross our T's and dot our I's, and satisfy, because this is not for us, it's for our city. And I think if we cover that well, then we can have someone come back and say, hey, what you guys, what's going on here? You guys kind of left us out of the room, you guys add this person, or it's not even a certain person, it's just, add to the group, and it kind of defines what we're doing here, and puts things more in perspective, and because going forward here, this just let's open up more topics of discussion. And like I said, earlier, in previous meetings, that we're being watched by other cities too. That's what I'm going to call out.
Totally agree on all points. So without all respect to your comments, I think with that said, we need to come up with some reasonable ground rules on who the fixed members are of the committee and what the protocol is for bringing others into the discussion and how we do that. So I don't want to chew up the top of this meeting with that subject, but I do want to go back before we move into Mr. Sharman's presentation and just kind of remind us all of the charter of our committee and ensure that we're all on board with that charter as we move through these discussions today and get into determining what our agenda will be for the coming weeks. And as we talked about in our very opening meeting, first and foremost was to promote dialogue among the interested parties, being the city council, the citizens, and members of industry and our environmental experts. Study the impacts of and assess the risks of oil and gas development within the city. We talked about this a bit last week, trying to pull our conversations back into those things that were truly applicable to Commerce City, and trying to keep out of that any topics that we couldn't directly tie into the decision-making process that we're trying to be part of here. So a concern that may have existed at a New Mexico well site, a different geology, different considerations, different state rules, doesn't necessarily make sense unless something very explicit about that example make sense to tie in. So just trying to guide our discussions in that fashion. Ultimately, we want to determine if and what changes to our city's land development code are needed, and provide a written recommendation to the city council for consideration in our deliberations, on ordinance 1880, which was the moratorium, the seeking of a moratorium on drilling activity in the city. And as folks know, that was a 30-day agreement out of the gate that allowed us to set aside that 6-month moratorium while we undertake these discussions. We have asked for consideration from COGA and from COGCC to extend that 30-day window by another 30 days to allow these discussions to continue before council takes final action on that ordinance and makes a decision in that regard. And it's my understanding from staff, just before the meeting, we've got members from both COGA and COGCC here, that there is an agreement to continue that by another 30 days, meaning that council on Monday would be asked to consider continuing that decision on the 6-month moratorium while we're inside of that 30-day window to allow these discussions to continue before we take that up for a vote. So
that will not be on the document?
It's on the agenda.
It is, okay.
Yep. And so the discussion by council will be, do we fly in the face of the agreement that we have from industry? Do we vote on that and put it into play? Which I would guess would have a negative impact on our ability to continue these discussions. And so that, I don't know if staff has any other comments.
In talking with the mayor, his hope is that this group can come to agreement to recommend the city council in Jason's report or another fashion at the 23rd, that this group is comfortable recommending a continuation of the ordinance that is up on Monday. So that this group can continue with surety that they can continue discussions from the days.
I guess that would be a discussion we would probably have to have with our city attorney and Bell, perhaps.
I think we need a general broad agreement with the members of this committee that it makes sense to do that or not. Separately, council will more than likely participate in an executive session with council to talk about any matters that are specific to legal advice in that regard. Steve?
I had asked the last meeting to all members what would it look like if we had a 4-month window. And I didn't get no one said they disagreed with that because there's just so much we have to do. And then being new on council, we have other issues as well. And not make this a weekly meeting, but maybe every other week, because we got too much information to decipher from. By the time you figure that out, our situation has gotten so broad that we need time to reflect on a meeting, and so we can collect our thoughts and process good thoughts going forward. That is meaningful discussion, and so everybody's time that's put in is worthwhile.
And I think those are all big points, and as we talked about last week, I think everyone with a nod of the head said, yes, these discussions do need to continue beyond the original 4-week window, which was part of the reason that we received the agreement to continue that voluntary stand down. I think it was also the impetus for us discussing better structure, very clear structure and progression of discussion for our ongoing meetings beyond today, using the second half of today's meeting to set really an agenda over the coming weeks to make sure that for each evening, we've got a very defined box around the discussion for that day. We can make sure that the right experts are there and that we're focusing preparation on the subjects in question for that night. So I think until we can take that progress back to council and get council's perspective on our progress, I don't know that we're in a position to make any other recommendation on changing the format of the meeting or otherwise. I don't know if there are any comments or thoughts in that regard. Okay. With that said, I don't want to go any further.
Jason, let me just, Phil Barber, special counsel. I can say with nearly 100% assurance that the objectives of this committee cannot be met in 4 weeks. And so for whatever that's worth, just in terms of drafting, just in terms of having people give their input before the drafting occurs and after, and the language, because I think it really is going to be a line-by-line analysis of whatever the council decides to do. And so for whatever it's worth, I think from my perspective, 4 weeks is just not going to be enough.
And I think those would be, to me, the subject of our executive session relative to legal strategy. We obviously have the considerations around the land development code to consider. We have the learning process that's occurring in this room. And I think one of the things that I heard from our first meeting was a desire on all parties to try and find those things that we could agree to mutually in these discussions and take action on those when we can. I think the land development code merits feedback from everybody in this room. And if your feedback is that that's not going to happen in 4 weeks, then we need to question, to Mr. Douglas's point, at some point does the frequency and focus of the meetings change? What does council want the role of this committee to be relative to that line-by-line review versus some other format? And so I think we need to come away from this with a recommendation to council to say, here's what we see. This is bigger than is going to occur given the current charter. We need your agreement to continue these discussions or something along those lines. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense, and I have no doubt that when it goes to council will be totally agreeable with extending it out how far we need it to get the right work done in the right time.
You know, Mr. Chairman, if I could offer something, you know, I think we're all willing participants in this process to educate everybody about the industry and what our plans are and potential impacts from any activity, if there's even any in Commerce City in the foreseeable future. But, you know, as you saw last week and you saw the week before and looking at the agenda going on out, you know, we're spending a lot of time reinventing the wheel here. I mean, this is nothing unusual that you're dealing with as compared to what Arapahoe County's been dealing with, as compared to what Loveland's dealing with. And so I think, you know, Phil just asked me a question before we sat down here. You know, I would suggest that we may not need to extend the moratorium because I do think that there are some issues potentially that the municipality needs to analyze before going into that setting. And as I said at the first meeting, I think you all will be pleasantly surprised at how cooperative industry is working with you to find you know, a situation that works best for your citizens as well as the community out here. But, you know, just, again, I don't want to waste anybody's time, but a lot of these issues have been addressed and dealt with, and, you know, having a forum for that educational purpose is great, but I'm not sure that it justifies extending the moratorium beyond, you know, the 30 days that you guys have adopted. So, you know, I think just from our perspective, and I don't know if Andrew or Brent want to weigh in, or Brandon want to weigh in, that would be kind of where we sit. You know, we've gone through this. We've dealt with municipalities and counties that have considered moratoria, and I think as we sit down with them, they all realize they're not such bad people, and they're willing to come in here and work with us. So let's get rid of the moratorium and figure out how best to move the ball forward instead of just putting our hands up and saying,
I think that's helpful feedback. I appreciate that.
So, like, this is Craig Geraldo with the CODCC, that, you know, from a state regulatory permitting standpoint, we do have 75 days to take action on a permit, at which point the applicant can request a hearing in front of our commission, at which point, you know, we'll be left, you know, trying to explain to our commissioners that we're holding up a permit application, which is otherwise valid, to kind of allow these things to play out here, which on a broad scale, looking at, you know, larger development across, you know, in Commerce City, adjacent to Commerce City, I think is a reasonable argument to make. It may be harder to make on an individual permit basis. So, you know, just from the agency's perspective, we do want to ensure that this meeting remains productive and continues to move forward with that goal in mind of providing recommendations to the council.
Can I add something in regard to Mr. Castillion? You mentioned that you've done this before over and over. Do you have a manual? Do you have things that you've offered? Have you given it to Mr. McEldowney, and have we been able to look at that?
We haven't been asked for that, but yeah, there are model ordinances that the Colorado Municipal League has adopted, that the Department of Local Affairs has drafted. So there are resources out there available for elected officials in dealing with this issue. So plenty of material and information.
And I think to that point, maybe Mr. Barber can take this comment. It's my understanding that Mr. Barber is reflecting on any number of example ordinances that impacted municipalities and development codes to consider where our code sits today and other codes that have been adopted. I mean, part of that is what, and we've heard this from the COGCC folks and the industry folks as well, we've got to carefully analyze what the sort of, I view it like this. The state regs are a puzzle piece, and we have to machine a puzzle piece that fits that puzzle piece with our regs. So what do we have to fill in the gap without getting ourselves in a protracted legal battle? And we want to do that through the most amicable way that we can. I don't know, Mr. Robert, if you want to jump in.
All I can say is that the regulations that I think Mr. Castillion is referring to range from no regulations at all in counties like Buena County to very extensive 50, 60-page regulatory schemes in La Plata County, Saguache County, Durango, et cetera. And what we are trying to do in the legal process, in light of the comments that we receive in the education, which I think is crucially important for this community, frankly, we've got the people here who ultimately we're trying to protect. And they are not doing this day in and day out like Chris and I and some of the other folks around this table are doing, so we're trying to educate them. But there's a whole range, there's no single set of ordinances, and I think we're trying to be sensitive to the community as well as industry and working through and coming up with a model that is as close to being acceptable by as many people as possible.
Did that help?
Yeah, that helps. I guess I was just wondering why we're in such a hurry. I mean, especially given our special circumstances. You know, it's going to be there. The shell's not going anywhere. So I guess I'm just wondering why. And the 30 days technically is actually up. I mean, we had 2 days where it was Christmas. We had the week before. So really, we've only had 2 land use meetings. So.
And with all due respect, it's up on the meeting that is set for next Monday. So we are scheduled to reconsider that motion at that time, which would be appropriate given the 30-day window. And we'll do so on Monday night, and we'll take the full consideration of this committee into that discussion. And Mr. Bullock and Mr. Douglas will do the same. So without further ado, Mr. Sharman, thank you for participating. I know you weren't unfortunately able to join us last week, but it's my understanding that you did have a chance to get at least some offline recap of the discussions to this point, and I would love to turn it over to you at this point.
I have some information to present on the screen.
You
so
may want to maybe
I'll
swap
switch
seats.
seats, and then
I've
maybe
done
swing
this for a
around.
long time, but I know how it goes. It's called musical chairs.
By the way, a technical question, do we need microphones in here to capture the voices, or are you hearing us all right?
I think we're good. We can always do Final Cut and edit the.
Well, good afternoon. Again, my name is Charlie Sharman. I'm the Army's program manager out at the Arsenal. And I did get a chance to take a look at the notes from last week, and I saw the topics that you were interested in hearing about the Arsenal. So I have plans to cover that today. I did switch the order of the last 2, so I will be covering groundwater second and the deep well history third. As you can imagine, the Arsenal is a very complex site, a very complex cleanup was done at the Arsenal. And in the interest of making sure we make the most of this group's time, I'm really going to be pretty brief in terms of the overview, and then I'd like to turn it over to you to ask any specific questions about the cleanup that I haven't covered. But again, I want to be brief because I think some of
Just for housekeeping, he's going to be presenting for how long, and then how long do the citizens have, just for preparation?
The format was a presentation from Mr. Sharman on the subject of the Arsenal, on
Right.
behalf of the Arsenal,
Okay.
and then Q&A. There was not a separate
Okay.
component to the agenda.
I want to make sure. Thank you.
Okay, and if it's okay, I'll entertain questions after each session there.
Probably best.
Hopefully this is visible by everybody in the room, but this is a map of the site, and again, on the northern side, it's 96th Avenue, on the southern side, it's 56th Avenue. On the west, We have Quebec Parkway and then Highway 2, and then on the east we have Buckley Road. The site was established in '42 to produce chemical weapons for the Army. And what I wanted to point out on this map is that a lot of the activity, really most of the activity out there took place in the center part of the site. And that was by design, so that there was a buffer of land between the activities and the community. That's the good news, is that we had production and waste disposal primarily in the center of the site. So that's really where a lot of the cleanup focused. And the remedy out there was primarily containment, where we took contaminated soils and structural debris and placed that in containment facilities. And we have 4 containment facilities out there. One of them is Basin A, Basin A consolidation area, which is shown by this dark line all around here. And that area was a former liquid waste disposal basin.
Better? More? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay.
And primarily what we had is contaminated soil located in that area, and there was a large volume, so we brought lightly contaminated soil into that area and used that as a consolidation site, and then put a soil cover over top of that. Then we have another similar basin, former Basin F, which is, and each of these sections is a square mile, so you'll hear me refer to them by section number. But section 26 up there is where the former Basin F was located, and that was about a 100-acre site where we did the same type of thing. We did excavate some contaminated soil and placed that into landfills, and I'll get to in a minute. But we did bring in some contaminated soil from the surrounding area and put a soil cover on top of that. And when I talk about soil covers, I'm talking about we used 18 inches of crushed concrete to serve as a barrier for burrowing animals, and then we put 4 feet of soil on top of that. So both of those cover areas, the Basin A consolidation area and the former Basin F cover area, are that design. The 2 other sites I wanted to talk about are the 2 landfills, and they're shown in section 25. And again, what we did, and shown in gray on this map, I think it looks gray, are all the sites where we did some soil excavation or building demolition work. And it's where we brought material either to the consolidation areas or the landfills. The first landfill, which is to the north, to the top of the screen, in green, is our hazardous waste landfill. And that was the first landfill constructed out there. It's a double-line hazardous waste facility. 2 liners both consist of 3 feet of clay and high-density polyethylene, basically plastic, thick plastic. Plus, below that is about 6 to 8 feet of prepared subgrade. So, in all total, there's probably 10 to 12 feet of material that makes up our liner system for the double-line landfill. And that facility took soil and debris from all across the arsenal. And its cover is, in addition to soil and crushed concrete, it also has a high-density polyethylene component to it, a plastic liner as well, or cover as well. The second landfill is the enhanced landfill, and it is very similar to the hazardous waste landfill, but it has a 3rd liner. So, in addition to the 2 3-foot clay liners and plastic, it has a 3rd 3-foot thick clay liner and a 3rd plastic layer as well. So, again, from the soil standpoint, we brought contaminated soil across the site into those facilities. In addition, our remedy consists of groundwater treatment. And I'll get to that in a little bit to talk about the groundwater plumes, but in general, groundwater moves to the north and northwest, and areas where we had contamination get down into the groundwater, we constructed a series of groundwater treatment plants. One that is closest to the source area is our Basin A neck groundwater system, which is located here. It treats a very low flow, high concentration groundwater stream. It's only about 15 gallons a minute at that location. As groundwater moves to the north and northwest, we have additional volume, but the concentrations decrease. Okay, so it's more efficient to treat the groundwater closer to the source areas. As we get to the boundaries, we have two systems, the north boundary at the top of the screen, and then the northwest boundary over to the left. Both of those systems pump contaminated groundwater out of the ground, use carbon, activated carbon for treatment, and then put clean water back in the ground. And I'll show you the groundwater flows here in a minute. The remedy, what you see here is all the work that was done, really started in earnest in the late 90s, and we completed it in 2010. So we now are really in the operation and maintenance phase of the cleanup. So I'll probably move on to groundwater, but are there specific issues that I want to capture? I may not answer them right now, but if there are some things that...
What volume do you pump, and is that going up or down? Is it pretty consistent?
Generally, it's decreased over time, and that's kind of the intent. As you put covers over these facilities, you're decreasing the amount of infiltration that occurs. So we have seen a drop in flow, but the north boundary probably is running around 200 gallons a minute right now. The northwest probably is in the neighborhood of about 500 to 600 gallons a minute. And those in the past have been considerably higher than that. As I mentioned, the Basin A-Next system is only about 15 to 20 gallons a minute right now. We also, I should mention, and I'll show it on another map, we do have an off-site treatment plant as well. And I'll show that in a little more detail on another map.
Would it be likely that this active treatment continues for many decades, or is it perpetual?
It is, especially the north boundary system. That's where we have our most complex number of chemicals, and the groundwater moves relatively slow, and so it takes a long time to flush out those chemicals from the aquifer. We do have a couple success stories where, and I didn't mention one of the small systems we have. We have another system here that only treats about 50 gallons a minute. It's our rail yard containment system. We had a spill at one time in this area. This was primarily a shipping and receiving area of the arsenal, so there wasn't active production over here. It was just mostly where chemicals came in and out. But there was a spill here that contributed to a plume that led to north up in section 28. There was another treatment plant there. And we only had 2 chemicals of concern in that area, and groundwater moves very rapidly on the western side of the arsenal. So that system in section 28 was installed in 1981, and this system here went in the early 90s. And in that time frame, we were able to clean the aquifer between this system and the boundary system at that location, and that allowed us to shut that system down. And we're continuing to operate this system, and we will until we meet drinking water standards at this location. So that's an example where we had fast-moving groundwater and we had only 2 chemicals, so it was a very successful groundwater treatment process. In other parts of the arsenal, the groundwater doesn't move as fast, and you have more chemicals, so it's a little bit more difficult. So we can expect to be treating or running these treatment plants for quite some time. The plan would be is that this system, I think, will pretty much be operating forever. But again, it's
how much do you pump in that?
That's about 15 to 20 gallons a minute in this system right here.
Okay.
The next system to be shut down may be the northwest boundary, because again, a higher flow, fewer chemicals, and we're seeing some dramatic improvements to the plume there, but that still may be decades. The north boundary system, we may be talking 100 years or more for that system. And I'll talk about the off-post system in a little bit. That's another one that we may shut down soon. Just depends on where you are.
This whole area, Rocky Mountain Arsenal, is this that we can on top, down below, are there any fault lines?
That's a good question, and I don't feel like I'm the person to be able to answer that. I talk a little bit about some of the activity seismic activity when I talk about a deep well.
Okay.
I don't have any maps that would show active faults and things like that, but it's possible one of the folks from the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission or other geologists in the room might be able to speak more about that. But that raises a good point in my mind in terms of just making sure you understand the setting here is that when I'm talking about groundwater contamination, I'm really talking about shallow groundwater contamination, the alluvial formation. What we have is the top layer where you have a lot of sands and gravels is alluvial material. Below that, you start to get in, we refer to bedrock formations, and the Denver Formation is next, and then the Arapahoe below that. We do not see much contamination at all below the alluvial. We do see a little bit in the Denver Formation, but by and large, that's not a very productive aquifer. It's a lot of clay with some sand lenses, but it's not a very productive zone. So we do see a little bit of contamination in the Denver Formation, but we don't actively pump the Denver Formation. We tried that at one time, and we saw that we were pulling contamination deeper. So we curtailed that. And what we see, we don't see a lot of migration in the Denver Formation. We see the bulk of the contamination in the alluvial, and that's where we actively treat. Again, I'll talk more about groundwater here in a second. Anything general remedy-wise that we wanted to touch upon that I did?
So what do you do with the treated water? I mean, is it part of Colorado's water supply? Do you have to put it back in the system, or what?
We do. Every gallon we pull out, we put back in. And the clean water is put back in the ground, immediately downgraded into our system. So it serves to flush out what contaminants may be downgrading into our system. And I can show that here in a second.
Sure.
Now I'll move on to groundwater. This is just a picture of one of that's the North Boundary Treatment Plant along 96th Avenue. You may recognize the blue building. This is a plume map from 1994. It's a composite plume map, so all the chemicals are kind of lumped together in terms of mapping for this particular slide. And I mentioned the production and disposal largely in the center. That's really where we start to see some groundwater contamination emanating from. Where this is the South Plants area where we started production. Basin A was a disposal basin. Basin F, another disposal basin. So each of those represent some sources. And this area here was the North Plants. Another production area that had some limited groundwater contamination, not significant. But as I mentioned, groundwater generally moves to the north and northwest, and that's why we located the treatment plants where we did in order to capture that contamination from moving off into the community. Now, before we put these systems in place, you can see that groundwater contamination did migrate off the arsenal. So this is 1994, what the plumes looked like at that time. Again, this is another 1994 shot, just the off post. But I wanted to show this because I have a direct comparison to a more recent plume on the next slide. And this is 2009. So what you see in the case of the northwest boundary, is very effective in again, stopping the contaminated groundwater from migrating off-site, and then re-injecting clean water to essentially flush the aquifer off the site. And the map shows, I should say, it's composite organic contaminants that exceed drinking water standards. So it's not just the presence, but at a level that would exceed drinking water standards. And that's our job is to make sure that we restore the aquifer to drinking water standards where it's usable again for drinking purposes. So northwest boundary, we had a lot of success. North boundary, success, but not complete. I mentioned the off-post treatment plants. We have one plant that's located along Peoria Street in this general area, and we pump from two different areas. First Creek and Highway 2, which is right here, and then further north of 104th Avenue, we have another extraction system. And groundwater from both of those locations is pumped back to a central treatment plant. Again, it's a carbon absorption system. And then after it is run through those absorbers, we then pump the clean water back to these locations for re-injection. And so what you're seeing, we're starting to see some separation. At one time, you saw a continuous plume. And now you're starting to see some separation where we're putting clean water back in the ground. The area, the size of the plume, down gradient of the treatment plant is starting to shrink. And we expect this to continue to shrink probably over the next decade to see it go below drinking water standards. So we no longer exceed standards. So the area between our north boundary and the off-post extraction systems is effectively isolated. We're putting in clean water here, it's flushing residual contaminants that exist here, and we're extracting it again at those two locations. It's hard to project how long it'll take to completely clean that and get it to below drinking water standards. Some of the chemicals, specifically pesticides, they move very slowly. They tend to bind on soil very readily, and they're harder to flush out of the aquifer. Other chemicals move more quickly, and they are treated more rapidly than pesticides. So it is likely to be, a couple of decades before we're able to get this below drinking water standards. Again, it's an alluvial system, treating that top aquifer. The good news about off-site is that people are either drinking municipal water or deep water. Folks that have private wells for potable purposes are generally in the Arapahoe Formation, which is below the Denver, or the Laramie Fox Hills, which is below the Arapahoe. So we don't see those aquifers being impacted by this contamination. And where we've had to drill, and this may be pertinent to some of your discussions, is that we have drilled deep wells in the areas of these plumes. And as long as you case off that top aquifer and seal it properly, drilling a deep well in that location is fine. The aquifer below is unaffected. We have seen some cases where deeper wells, Arapahoe wells, that were poorly constructed or had a cracked casing, where alluvial water did leak down to the Arapahoe Formation. And we saw some localized contamination around that area, but by and large, the Arapahoe is not contaminated. Where you had those situations occur, it was highly localized, and when we went in to install a new well properly at that location, we saw clean water. So it's a kind of testament that you can, if properly installed, you don't have any concern about drilling in these areas at all. The alluvial aquifer is over-appropriated. If you've heard from South Adams County Water and Sanitation District, when they go out and pump the alluvial, they need to put a gallon back in for every gallon they pull out, and it's very difficult through water court to get that through. So they have to have a specific recharge plan. So average citizens like us can't go out there and drill an alluvial well. It's without, a lot
Charlie,
of different.
how deep were the deep wells that you were drilling in that area?
The replacement drinking water wells? Okay. I don't know off the top of my head, I'm guessing in the 500 to 600 range. I don't know, Ken, if you remember.
Yeah, that's about what the Arapahoe is, 4 to 500. So.
And be glad to get that for you, Sandy. And we installed, I think, 3 or 4 Arapahoe wells, where we replaced a bad well, or where somebody was at the time had a historic alluvial well. We either hooked them up to a municipal supply, or we drove them a deep well. And so we have records of that. Renee?
Charlie, could you just go back to 1994, And then the 2009, because a lot of people that saw 1994 before the 2009 didn't get the significance of how small the plume has gotten since then. So I just wanted them to see the difference in the two plumes from 1994 to 2009.
2009. So that's a 15-year period. And I'm projecting within a decade that the contamination down gradient of the systems will probably go below drinking water standards. So
Is that primarily because of pollution? You're not mining it, it's not coming
that's
back
right.
towards you?
That's right. You're basically, it's attenuating, it's being flushed out by clean water. And I should point out, we only have one chemical that exists downgrading of our system. It's diisopropyl methylphosphonate. It's related to Army's operations out there, DIMP. You may have heard of it, but that's the only chemical we have downgradient of our treatment extraction systems. And it tends to move fairly quickly with water. It doesn't bind on the soil.
I have
It's
two
pretty soluble.
questions. First of all, in just synopsis version, how do you measure and know where the plumes are? And is this the most recent map that you have, the 2009?
It's the most comprehensive. We do quarterly sampling and annual sampling, but in terms of the
What do you mean
wide...
by sampling?
Sorry.
What do you
Okay,
mean?
sampling, it's just a matter of taking a pump to a well and pumping out water and taking it to a laboratory for chemical analysis.
Okay. So my original two questions, how do you measure this? How do we know that that's accurate? And then, again, you said this is really the most recent, is 2009.
Right. And we won't have another comprehensive sampling effort to draw into the plume for a couple of years. So we don't do it every year. We're finding that it doesn't change dramatically year to year. So taking snapshots every few years is sufficient to kind of keep a handle on it. But to answer your question, we have a series of wells. I don't know the number offhand off-site. We have at one time, we had over 3,000 wells on-site to characterize where the contaminants are. Off-site, we probably have a couple hundred wells that we use to characterize and draw the plume. It's not precise. I mean, we do have well points out in this area. I don't have a map that shows them, but essentially you interpret between points. You have some that are non-detect and you have some with detections, and then you basically determine what it would be. Now, one last point I want to point out that part of the characterization of this area is not just the chemical concentrations, but it's the underground formation. Generally, what you're looking for, essentially you have underground stream beds. In a lot of cases, you have bedrock highs, if you will, with in between you have alluvial formation. So groundwater and contaminants generally would follow the path of least resistance, and that is sand and gravel versus going through clay or bedrock. So when you take a look at the underlying geology out there, that helps you also show you where groundwater flows, and that helps us locate our treatment plants or our extraction systems, and also helps you see where the contaminants are going.
Right. Well, Mr. Bullock pointed out that there was such a huge change from the first map to this map that I'm just wondering why you wouldn't, given the fact that there's such a pronounced difference, why you wouldn't measure that every year. I mean, potentially you'd think that maybe it could go the opposite direction. It could go from being okay to back to the way it was. So that's
a very good question. And as we get closer to potential shutoff, you may want to increase the frequency. But as I mentioned, we're likely to be treating for decades. So you want to be efficient with your resources because the picture changes a little bit. But keep in mind, that's 15 years.
Okay.
So, if we take a look at it at 3 snapshots between 1994 and 2009, if you took a look at it every 5 years, that would tell you enough, I think, to show you how it's shrinking. Because I don't think you're going to see a dramatic difference next year from this. But 3 or 4 years from now, you'll see probably enough to be able to...
Could you potentially in the year, could something go wrong where if you didn't...
Well, you do enough around your systems. Like I said, we do quarterly monitoring around our treatment plants in order to make sure that we're extracting what we expect to extract and that we're re-injecting what we expect to re-inject. So there are control and operational sampling and analysis that go on all the time, but in terms of a large number of samples out in your plume area, you want to try to do that as efficiently as you can, and we think every few years is enough on that.
You said that there was 3,000 wells. Those are all vertical, right?
On the site, yeah.
Right. And well, I'm sure they're all different types of depth. I'm not sure, but they're not all the same level depth.
Right. Most of them, we have two types of well. We have alluvial wells on site, and we have some Denver Formation wells on site. We don't have any Arapahoe Formation, which is the next aquifer down.
Okay.
Okay, so we've characterized the alluvial and the Denver Formation, and
So as far as your map over there, because the one on the left is the arsenal, correct? On the
Over here?
wall? Yeah.
Yeah, actually, this was going to get into next with the deep well. But these are this is basically a cross-section. I don't know if you can see this map, but it goes from the arsenal out to the Hillcore Energy well out there. And that well was drilled to a deep depth of, I think, 8,000, 8,500 or something like that. Our deep well was drilled to a depth of about 12,000 feet. Okay, so what you have is the geologic formations that are shown here from the coring of those wells. You can characterize the formation. So we're up here, the Denver and Arapahoe Formation.
Okay.
The alluvial is above that. It's just not labeled here. The alluvial is up here, this lighter area up here. Drinking water generally would go down to the Laramie and the Fox Hills. When you get to the Pierre Formation, it's a shale. It's a really thick rock. I mean, so you're not getting water production in that zone. And you can see you have about 6,000 feet of that formation, and I'm sure there's geologists in the room who can talk more about that. But I'll talk about the deep well here in a second. But what we're talking about when we're talking about groundwater, it's really in the upper, shown on here, it's upper 1,500 feet. Really, the top 1,000 feet in the area we're talking about, I think.
And so your average groundwater monitoring well that makes up your monitoring system is on the order of?
Up in this area, the interface between the alluvial and the Denver Formation may be in the 50-foot range, 60-foot range. On the western side of the arsenal, it's probably closer to 100 feet, 110. So it just varies depending on where you are in the arsenal. If you're in the center of the arsenal, around the salt plants area, you have alluvial that's only, say, 5 feet thick there. Denver outcrops in that area.
I was curious, air quality monitors around the area as well?
There has been pretty extensive air quality.
Do you install them and take them away, or how long do they stay?
Yeah, we a big part of our remedy, which we implemented our record decision beginning in 1997, and that was a lot of the active cleanup work. Okay, so we started air monitoring at that time. We used a dozen stations. There were 10 on site, and there were 2 off site. And so we did extensive air monitoring to make sure that our operations out there were not affecting the community. And by and large, what we saw is the best air in the region is on the arsenal. We're not impacted by traffic and things like that. We're picking things up like benzene and whatnot, which you would expect from auto emissions and things like that. Whereas on the arsenal, we didn't see a lot of that because there's a lot of open space. We did see locally around some of our cleanup sites, we did see some chemical emissions coming from our excavations, but by and large, they weren't getting to the arsenal perimeter at the perimeter air monitoring stations.
So, Charlie, what's your annual operating budget? What's it costing the public to clean this up? Has it been pretty constant?
The total amount to reach the completion of the cleanup was around $2.1 billion. In terms of annual operating costs, we're still trying to get to that level off. time, but we're projecting probably around 10 million
Annually.
annually.
Hey, Charlie, I just have a couple of questions. You said that, you talked about the water sampling on site. Are you still doing water sampling on site, and how much are you doing?
You bet. Again, it varies depending on where you are. Around the water treatment plants, we're doing quarterly analysis. Around our landfills, we're doing quarterly analysis. Regionally, we're doing twice every 5 years. We're doing an extensive array of wells. So we have to get specific about, where.
So do you have updated plume maps then for like 2009 for on-site as well as for off-site?
I believe we have, I believe we have one for 2009. It may not be as, our next complete round will be 2014 in terms of generating another plume map that's driven by the largest number of control points will be 2014.
Is the on-post plume map available to us? We'll get that.
Sure,
sent
if it's
electronically?
available in a report, believe me, whatever is available to you. So I just don't know exactly offhand what version of the on-post plume map we have. It may go back a few years,
So I'd like to talk about monitoring in the context of what they're all discussing here with fracking sort of in the neighborhood, so to speak. Just based on what I know of your monitoring program off-post, it's basically designed, I think you have, 10 wells up there, monitoring wells?
Off-post?
Off-post?
Oh, no. It's probably a couple hundred.
It's designed to make sure that the assumptions that you have about where the plumes are and where the treatment centers are working properly. That's basically what that monitoring is for, correct?
And to monitor the plume over time and show it shrink or disappear.
So if there's fracking in the neighborhood, will your groundwater monitoring program change so that you can look to see if the underlying rock structures are being affected in such a way that contamination can change its pathway on the arsenal?
We're not looking at, these are water samples we're taking.
Right.
We're not continuing to take soil cores or geologic samples. So no, we're not going to address any. But again, all we're looking for is groundwater contamination. That's whether there's any adverse impact there. We're not seeing that activity from the gas well installations is dramatically impacting this at all or affecting it at all.
Are you monitoring that though? How do you know that? That's my question. Do you really, how
Well,
do you say that you know that?
again, we monitor the groundwater,
Right.
okay, and we monitor to show how the plumes are changing. We don't have we're not for or against this. We're for cleaning up our contamination. And what we're seeing is that, as I mentioned before, is if whether it's a gas well or whether it's an Arapahoe drinking water well, if it's installed correctly through these plumes, we're not, even if we're in the middle of a plume, we're not seeing it adversely impacting our operations. So
What about spills in that regard?
that's a different question. Now, and that's something that, whether it's the oil and gas industry, a gas station, or whatever it may be, are responsible for operating in compliance with all the requirements. And fortunately, we're not seeing much activity at all in this area. And I'm not sure about oil and gas exploration, but for what the plan is in the future, I don't want to be speaking about that. But in terms of, there's Eagle Creek, the residential community is right here. We have a little bit of development going up in this area, and I have a different map that shows the neighborhoods. But I'm sorry.
Turnberry neighborhood.
Turnberry, thank you. So other than that, there's not a lot of activity that we know of in here in terms of development, or doesn't mean that there's not plans for a gas well, but I don't know of it. So.
Well, let's do parameter. Your principal focus off the arsenal is to look for DIM.
And other chemicals in here. Would it beyond that?
Would it include benzene, pyrene? That's already in your survey.
I'm pretty sure. I'd have to double check our analyte list. What comes to mind? We have probably a handful of driver chemicals. In other words, those are the ones that we find the most and drive our treatment. And for example, deodorant is a pesticide. It's basically this is what's in this plume here is deodorant, pesticide. Carbon tetrachloride is another one we look for. And I think trichloroethylene is another one that is in our plume. Benzene, toluene, xylene, I'm not off the top of my head. I don't think it's a driver, but whether we do analysis for that, I'd have to check our analytic list. We do have it on site. I just don't know that it's a chemical that drives our operations off-site.
So, just to kind of piggyback this discussion with some of these discussion and questions for the last couple of weeks, we asked to see if industry could help us put together a map of, I think it was considered positions in the area. What would be helpful to me, I guess, is to get a map that essentially overlaid the plume information over time and how that plume is decreasing. So maybe we have maybe it's an integrated picture of the plume that shows the fallback of the plume, color-coded by biggest to smallest plume, if that makes sense. And then in that same map, the positions, the known wells in position. So, is there anything in this area? Where do the potential well activities exist relative to the plume? And that might help us from a consideration perspective say, well, everything is way away, or you know what, there are going to be wells drilled through the plume, as Charlie said. So without having that fact in hand, we can use the two.
Can I speak briefly to this? This is Greg with the COGCC. We do have a number of plugged and abandoned wells within Commerce city limits. On the north, section 14, which is just north of the north boundary system, section 22, 21, and 15, which is between the northwest boundary system and the Highway 76. And I brought a number of these maps. I can pass them around.
Is that also something that we can get a soft copy of to add to the website?
Sure, and I think this may have already been provided. This is from Debbie Baldwin's presentation the other night, but nonetheless, it does show 9 plugged and abandoned wells in that area. So there's no active or producing oil and gas wells proximate to those plumes. There are plugged and abandoned wells. The well that you see as this map comes around, there's a symbol in section 26, and that is the deep injection well for the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. Regarding, there's no current permit activity in that area either. So,
okay,
great. That helps a little bit.
Thank you very much.
It might be good to move on, but before we do, I wanted to ask Ken to maybe talk about what Tri-County does off the arsenal. It's a big component of our monitoring program out there. And I just should mention that in addition to the regulatory agencies, we also had citizens involved in the cleanup over the years. And so, they're a resource also to get a perspective on what's going on with the arsenal cleanup. We had a Restoration Advisory Board. Sandy with the Site-Specific Advisory Board was active and received a lot of information over the years. But Ken, not only has he been with the program for a long time, and watched the cleanup progress, but Tri-County Health Department as an agency has been a big presence in the community, monitoring wells, talking to residents about the contamination where it is. Ken, maybe with that.
Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, let me just take a couple minutes. And the issue with going second is, he stole most of my presentation, but I just want to touch on a few things to hopefully clarify some things. Again, Charlie mentioned I'm Ken Conrad at Tri-County Health Department. Basically worked in public health since 1974. In 1974, Tri-County began a groundwater monitoring program in private wells off the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, which I've been involved with since then. So let me just go through this. I think it'll be quicker. As far as groundwater goes off-site, no one is drinking contaminated groundwater. Either if people did have contaminated groundwater, they were offered a replacement tap through South Adams County, through the hookup program that the Army funded, or that, again, a replacement well was drilled, as Charlie mentioned. Again, Charlie pointed out on the first map of the arsenal where the majority of the contamination was generated. This remedy for this particular site is a containment remedy. Citizens expected 1,000-year criteria. Not that any of us will be around for 1,000 years, but the amount of effort in design, construction, and oversight that went into this particular project, it really is an engineering marvel. And it's just amazing the amount of effort that went into assure that. There's no contamination on the ground. Again, Charlie mentioned 4 foot of topsoil covers any area that ever was involved with any manufacturing contamination or any of that.
In regard to that, can I interject really quickly? How long is that expected to last? I mean, I understand that the 4 foot topsoil is chemically treated to avoid the absorption of water?
The beauty of using soil's been around a long time, as we all know. The idea is that's why it was used, so it would last forever. When you go to a synthetic liner or cover or something, there is a life to those. And there was a demonstration project to show that the amount of cover used with native vegetation on top of it provided equivalent to a brick cover, which is the synthetic liner, synthetic cover and all that stuff. So it really was designed to last forever. And there's maintenance. Tri-County does oversight to assure that if there's a flood, again, I guess an earthquake and there's cracks, that those are filled in and taken care of, that animals don't get on it and burrow into it. And whatever, as long as it's maintained, the maintenance isn't great. It's native soil with native vegetation.
Ken, her question was treated soil, there's no treated soil.
No.
Okay.
It's topsoil. The 4 foot is over any.
Okay, I had spoke to Susan Newton over at the EPA, and she had mentioned to me that some of the grass on the top was treated chemically as to not allow water to be absorbed through there, in addition to the plants and vegetation on top. That was at least what I wrote down. So that's where my question was based from Susan in my conversation with her.
When we're done, let's just, I don't think it is. I mean, it might be treated so it germinates better or something, but I don't think that the grass itself is necessarily treated.
We use soil amendments.
Yeah.
Manure
and whatever to make.
Because when we put the cover systems in, we didn't always use topsoil. In some cases, you were using soil that might have been down 3 or 4 feet, which doesn't have a lot of organic nutrients to it. And so if you just put it on there, it's not going to maybe grow grass as well. So we did use soil amendments from actually local community. And
maybe that's what she was referring to, that it was made so it would grow the native vegetation.
The only other treatment we would do on that would be for weed control. It's important to keep noxious weeds from overtaking the cover, because that's not the vegetation we want on there. So we do.
Who monitors that? And who takes care of the animals burrowing and issues if there is an earthquake and there's cracks or whatever?
We do routine inspection. It's the Army's responsibility to have a contractor or their people to do maintenance and whatever that's required.
So how often is that done, just out of curiosity?
Well, it depends. We do monthly inspections and quarterly inspections. And after significant events, so if we have a significant rainfall, and I forget the trigger, but if it's a significant rainfall, we'll go out and look for erosion.
And let me say, I can talk about the Arsenal for years, so if you want to call me, I'm happy to meet with any of the new council people, certainly, by all means, after you kind of get your feet on the ground. We do an orientation program we'd love to share with you kind of as a background to what has gone on at the Arsenal. As Charlie mentioned, the landfills, the caps, the covers were designed. Remember, we talked about basins. There's basin A all the way to F at least. Those were depression, so water got in there, percolated down. All the caps and covers, all the design now is to sheet water away from contamination. Tri-County has an extensive off-post groundwater monitoring program. As I mentioned, we really started in 1974 when we were trying to look for groundwater contamination all the way around the Arsenal. Now we're focused in this area, like this, coming from Second Creek and the South Platte River going that direction.
How many wells do you have that you're sampling right now?
Well, Sandy, we started out with like 560, and we're down to about 220, 250, something like that, that are available for sampling. It's just development and everything. And now South Adams provides community, city water out there, so there's a lot less relying on individual wells and things like that. Tri-County has an agreement with the state engineer's office, the groundwater engineer's office. In this particular area, if someone comes in applies for a well permit, there's a notification on the permit to contact Tri-County Health Department. We in turn contact the applicant for the permit and advise them of anything that they need to know, either history of the area, anything like that that's applicable. If they do drill a well, we put that into our database. We also will test that put it into our testing program and monitoring program. Again, regulatory oversight here at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal was extensive. Certainly the EPA, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, Tri-County Health Department, the local health department did oversight. Additional oversight, of course, was done by private contractors and citizens group. Oversight, of course, included remedial investigation studies which went on prior to the record of decision. Of course, the remedy design, execution, and monitoring. Long-term operation and maintenance of the remediation program is in place. It's part of the record so that, again, somebody's out there looking at this to see that it continues to perform the way that it should. 5-year reviews. As a CERCLA site, 5-year reviews are required where the site is looked at to see if the remedy is still protected. Again, Tri-County Health Department will continue to do monitoring into the future on caps, covers, and monitor off-post groundwater. I wanted to take this time, and I don't think it's been said enough, but in my public health career, which I counted on my fingers, is coming up on 40 years, the citizens of Commerce City and anything I've ever dealt with have been wonderful. And I think they should be recognized for the amount of effort that they want to go to, that they take out of their day, and whatever, to make sure that complex issues like this, a lot of places just don't have, like the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. Oil and gas exploration is probably, I know it's a hot topic at the moment, but to me, the remediation of Rocky Mountain Arsenal was a very complex issue for a city to have to deal with. So certainly I'm confident you can deal with oil and gas exploration in a responsible manner. Matter of fact, the involvement of the citizens was so unique. At DOD sites, it was used as an example that they use across the country now. Never before had a citizen representation been in record of decision negotiations. Groups? Yes?
I'm sorry, when you're done with that section, could you just briefly touch on the health impacts, if there are any of citizens in the outlying areas, higher incidence of cancer, if they had whatever things might have had above and beyond the rest of the committee? Or
There's been extensive, there was a medical monitoring group, again, a group of citizens, local citizens, and experts, including folks from ATSDR, which is a branch of CDC, extensive studies of cancer indices in the area were done. The group really just became inactive like 2 years ago. They issued a final report saying that there was no indication that cancer indices in this area is any different than anywhere else in the control areas that they used and whatever. So there was no indication of excess cancer rates.
No other health effects either?
Nope. I'll list the RAB, the Restoration Advisory Board, the Northern Community Coalition, the Citizen Site-Specific Advisory Board, and Citizens Against Contamination. Were all groups that were formed throughout this process, and I want to point out some folks in this room. You all that are new to Commerce City, and I hope folks I hope this is on Channel 8 so they know who experts are around here that certainly can give you a lot of information, include Renee Wallach, Rick Teeter, Sean Ford, Tracy Snyder, Kathy Teeter, Reba Droder, Dave Busby, Scott Jakewith, Sandy. I was using Commerce City residents, but since you were born here, I'm going to go ahead and say Sandy Jakewith. I think she still lives in Denver, I'm sorry. You need to move back to Commerce City. Larry Ford, Paul Natal, Jeanette Lewis, Olga Lewis, Harlow Leeper, and many others. Again, there was a variety of, again, committees, groups, and whatever that had to work on this. And we do not, and if there is an issue that comes up, we're in a position to address it long
Well,
term.
speaking of citizens, we have a group of about 150 that have kind of gotten together, and obviously all of them are very concerned about the issue of the RMA. And we've kind of collected some things, so are you guys done with your presentation? Because I'd kind of like to go through and make sure that we're addressing what the citizens wanted me to address or us to address today.
We want to touch on the deep well, Charlie does.
Okay.
Just, that was part of what Jason called for us to do, and we're...
Yeah, because we're hitting 4:30, so.
Yeah, so just, Charlie, if you don't mind, one question, real quickly. With such experience there of drilling 300 or 400 monitoring wells, what would you think of the estimated cost to drill a 50-foot monitoring well? The cost to
50-foot?
Mm-hmm. And then to run samples year.
Well, that's to put it in, you're probably only talking, tens of thousands of dollars, 10,000. If it's a 2-inch well, 4-inch well will be a little more expensive, but the monitoring, depending on what suite of chemicals you do, I think our cheapest analysis might be $500. That doesn't include sampling, the labor include the sampling. So you're looking at a couple $1,000s a sample probably when you're talking about labor and analytical costs. In many cases, we run 2, 3, 4, or 5 methods on a sample, so that's going to drive up the cost closer to $2,000 as opposed to $500. But to do a single suite, generally you might be talking $500 and then another, say $500 in labor costs to get the sample.
Ken, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Hey,
Certainly.
What's your budget for monitoring out there? What does Tri-County spend on
What about 250,000 a year?
250,000 a year? Does that come from the taxpayers of the counties, or is that some of that from EPA?
That's money from
Also the Army pays. So in addition to what you're spending, there's another 250,000. Whereas
It's
you're
part-
10 million a year.
It's part of that. That was from the-
We fund the EPA, the state, and Tri-County to perform oversight.
Isn't it the Army and Shell?
That was part, I'm sorry.
Isn't it the Army and Shell?
It's the Army and
Okay.
Shell, yeah.
So the 10 million covers them too.
Those were agreed to submarines and meetings.
Just real quickly, on agenda maintenance, we'll go through the remainder of your presentation. I don't want to cut any of that short. I've got Tom printing a document to help frame our discussion on the meeting structure for the coming meetings. I've taken some input from our discussion last week, some discussion or some items that I got offline, and we'll use that handout to help frame and accelerate that discussion, and then make sure that we take pause at 10 should we have any questions from citizens. And then I know we've got folks that have a hard stop at 5 o'clock, so I want to be sensitive to that. So with that, Charlie, back to you.
And I'll try to run through this pretty quickly here. I understand there's been some concerns about our deep well and waste that was disposed in the 60s. Briefly, we constructed it in 1961. It was drilled to a total depth of 12,045 feet and cased and sealed to 11,975 feet. So the bottom 70 feet was really that target injection zone for waste that we injected. We injected about 165 million gallons of liquid waste, and that was from 62 to 66. And probably many of you are familiar with the earthquakes occurred during that time frame that were attributed to the deep well, or at least suspected to be related to our deep well injections. So we stopped all injections in 1966, and Tremor stopped at that point. So there may not be hard evidence, but there's certainly an anecdotal or a correlation there between the deep well injection work and earthquakes in the Denver metro area. So nothing, the well wasn't used for injection since 1966 up until 1985, which is when it was closed. There was some experimental work done with it in the late 60s. Principally, instead of injecting waste, they extracted a few 100,000 gallons of waste back out of the well to see if that would cause any seismic activity. And they pulled about 350,000 gallons of liquid waste back out. And there were some slight tremors in the area, so again, that was the limited amount of research that was done on that. But no more waste was injected there since 1966.
What did they do with the liquid they pulled out?
You know, I don't know exactly, Sandy. My guess is they were using liquid disposal basins at the time, so my guess is they continue to use liquid disposal basins for that, but I don't know for certain. I need to research it a little bit. And I should mention that at the time, using just evaporation basins was really the common practice for disposal of liquid waste. We were running out of capacity, so that's one of the drivers for constructing a deep well was to inject liquid waste into the ground. And it's still used today in Oklahoma and Texas and other places in the country. So in 1985, well, first of all, in 82, we, as part of an agreement with the regulatory agencies, we agreed to close that deep well. And the process we used, not to get into too much detail, but the inner casing, which ran about 9,000 feet and is about 5.5 inches in diameter, was pulled and inspected, and that was recycled. And it was intact based on the reports we have received on that. And then cement plugs were placed down near the injection zone, around 11,000 feet to 12,000 feet. Also at 4,400 to 4,600 feet, which is really right in the center of that Pierre Shale that I showed on the cross-section over there. And then again around 1,500 feet, which is at the bottom of the Fox Hills. Between the Fox Hills and the formation below that is the Pierre Shale. I mentioned the Fox Hills is the lowest water-bearing zone. Okay, so another cement plug was placed at that interface between the Fox Hills formation and the Pierre Shale. So basically to seal off at three different zones, access, if you will, from the waste that we injected down at 12,000 feet on up.
And then, real quick question on the plugs. Any reason why they used individual plugs as opposed to a solid casing through that, or filler, if you will?
Well, that's effectively what they use, and drillers in the area can probably talk more about this, but to plug the bottom of the hole, they just fill it with cement. Okay, and that sets up and it serves as
so when I envision a plug, it's small, but I guess relative to the overall depth, you're talking about a fairly sizable plug at three different depths, is that right?
Right. And you can see basically 1,000 feet thick.
Okay.
In this case, it was 200 feet, and here it was from
1,500 feet of range. I got you. It's between 10.9 and 12.
Yes, I'm sorry. If I didn't make that clear, it was between those.
That's the depth of each of those.
That's how thick the plug is.
Perfect.
And then, basically to, I think, be more efficient, they used more of a soil bentonite slurry of mud that sets up for the rest of the casing. Okay, they don't cement the whole thing.
Gotcha. So it's not a void.
That's right. That's right. I'm sorry if I didn't make it clear. So at the very bottom, you have a cement plug between 10,900 feet and the 4,400 feet. You have, or 4,600 feet, I should say.
Your slurry.
You have the slurry, which is a mix of soil and bentonite.
Great.
And that, when it dries out, it sets up similar to cement, but just not as tight. And then, again, between 4,400 and 1,500, you have that same soil bentonite mix. And so the whole casing depth was filled with something, either cement or the slurry. And I should just talk briefly about the construction. And that when I talk about telescoping wells, we had 4 different casings to seal off different aquifers. Okay, the first one was a 20-inch casing, which was I think 200 feet in depth, which seal off basically the alluvial and the Denver formation. The next one down.
Was that submitted back to surface?
I believe so. I have a cross-section in there that I can check, the construction details on that. Basically, you're routing around that. And the materials I have, specifics on that. But in general, you're talking about an outer casing of 20 inches, and I think it goes to 13 and a half, down to 8, I think, and then the center one was 5 and a half. And again, each of those seals off a zone that you're concerned about, whether it's Denver, Arapahoe interface, or it's the Fox Hills and Pierre Shale interface, or down to 11,000 feet, which is the last interface. I think they did the 8-inch casing went down to 11,000 feet, and then they used a seal on the hole around that. So I think it was like a cement or some other type of seal they put around that. Keep the hole.
Yeah, question. You know, when they first bored the hole to inject the chemicals, what spacing was that? I mean, because we're talking 165 million round of fluid that's pumped into the ground, right?
Right.
So, how was that extracted to make the hole big enough to accommodate that amount of fluid? Because it wasn't just a hole there. I mean, 12,000 feet down.
Right. The hole was drilled to 12,000 feet,
okay.
And I think they used a 10-inch auger there.
I think he's asking about the formation.
I understand. I'm getting to that. So it's drilled 12,000 feet, okay, and then they pulled back to around it was 11,975. So 70 feet at the bottom of that was an open hole.
Yeah.
And in order to test how the fluid would go into the formation down there at that injection zone, they injected clean water. And they used that as a test to see the rate at which the water would basically flow into that formation. And we're in the Precambrian rock, basically, full title, but basically you have the 70-foot gap of, say, a 10-inch hole that the water goes into, and then it disperses into that formation. Okay, so they tested with water, just drinking water, at the rate at which that would leak out into that formation, essentially. Okay, so they tested that, and then they actually injected the liquid. Okay, and what they found is that the liquid waste they were disposing that wasn't going out at the same rate as the water did, so they had to slow. It took a longer period of time to inject 165 million gallons, and that took place over 4 years.
Right.
So it wasn't like they put it down and it was gone in a week. It kind of leaked out in that formation that's 12,000 feet in the ground over a period of time.
So there was no seal down there. They didn't. I mean, nowadays you can seal off the area now with the technology or so. I'm not saying 12,000 feet, but because I saw in there, maybe I'm looking at it wrong, that it was sealed, that whole area down there.
Yeah,
before the injection?
I don't know if this will be clear or not. Let's see. You probably can't read it, but I can maybe try to point out. This is the depth of our deep well, which is 12,000 feet. Okay, so essentially they over-drilled 70 feet and left that open down at the bottom. And then when we injected waste, it went down into that zone, and then it basically dispersed out into that Precambrian rock down there.
Okay.
Okay, and then when we closed it, we did put a cement plug from here up to 10,900 feet, so right around here.
I see.
So picture that cement
out in the ground.
That's a cement plug after we closed it. Okay, and then we filled up to 4,600 feet, which is probably higher than my reach, but right around here, with that bentonite soil slurry, okay,
Right.
which sets up as a solid to fix over time. We put another cement plug and then put that soil bentonite slurry all the way to 1,500 feet, and from 1,500 feet to the surface was this another cement plug, if you will. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so anyway, that's what we use to ensure that the waste that we injected down here at 12,000 feet was not coming back up the hole. And generally speaking, once the liquid's down there, and gravity takes over, it's not going up unless it's under pressure. And we didn't see pressures that would cause that to come up through rock.
Okay. So how much PSI did you use to force that liquid into that formation?
That's a great question. I don't have that off the top of my head.
It'd be interesting because how much are you guys using in Halbert? 15,000?
It's somewhere between 3,500 PSI up to 7,000.
So here's my question, and again, not coming from a scientific standpoint, so pardon my ignorance, but in all of the information that I've read, that the group has read, that we came across some articles on where the chemical that was actually pressurized and put into the ground was actually tested on some metal or some, basically tested to see how the metal would respond. And I remember reading something about it where it said that the chemicals were so toxic that the metal was almost corrosive. Yeah, corrosive is the word I'm looking for. My question is, how do you know it went to the 12,000 feet? How do you know that that pipe that's carrying that toxic chemical wasn't corroded? How do you know it didn't come, the bottom part of the pipe didn't corrode completely? How do you know it didn't stop up at the 7,000 feet? How do you know that it didn't corrode in certain areas and come out maybe at the very top?
Well, not the very top. I think they have evidence of that, but that's a very good question. You know, I mean, obviously from the operations, they monitored how much they were putting in and then the rate at which it was going down into that zone. That was the only,
How did they monitor that? How did they track that?
just from water fluid levels in the well.
So what do you mean by that? Again, I have
Okay,
no scientific, I don't have a scientific mind. You have to.
Pressure.
And excuse me, didn't you
Okay.
say that they pulled the 5.5-inch casing out and inspected it?
They did. Well, I was going to get to that. Yeah. That's the quick answer in terms of your question about corroding metal. You may be thinking about another project. We had another project on the site where we did have a waste that was corroding away some equipment that we were using. But this particular project, we pulled that 9,000 feet of intercasing, inspected it, and it was intact.
Is there documents showing that 9,000 feet went in and 9,000 feet came out?
Yeah, we have.
Can we get that? Is that possible? I mean, that's something that our citizens are concerned about.
I mean, we have a report that indicates that 9,000 feet was basically pulled out, decontaminated, and taken off site. I don't
Wasn't
know whether it
12,000
was.
feet put in?
I'm sorry?
Wasn't 12,000 feet put in?
Not in the center. I need to.
There are different
to
cases,
draw
what
you.
you're
Yeah,
saying.
see,
Okay.
the one that went to 12,000 feet or 11,000 feet was an 8-inch casing. And I talked about the telescoping. Okay, the one that went to 11,000 feet was 8-inch, and that stayed in place. It was.
Oh, so that
filled
wasn't
with-
pulled out of
That
review?
was not
Okay.
pulled out. Only the center 9,000 feet, which is 5.5 inches in diameter, was pulled out. Okay, and that was inspected. Okay, so the 8-inch casing,
Is still in place?
was still in place.
And the 20-inch casing is still in place? Gotcha.
and that, again, the 20-inch casing only goes down to, I think, 200 feet. The 13.5-inch casing goes down, I think, to 1,500 or 1,600 feet. The 8-inch casing goes down to 11,000 feet, and they pulled the center to 9,000 feet.
What was the cementing program for the 8-inch casing at depth? And this may tie into the question that Steve was kind of asking in terms of when they were injecting, what was the cementing between the casing there and the annulus? Do you know how much cement they put in, or?
During the construction?
Yeah.
Or during closure, I guess.
During construction. In other words, so what was during injection when you had 13, when you were injecting under pressure, what was preventing your fluids from coming out of the
okay, I see.
annular space?
Yeah, they had plugs, and I can show you a diagram.
Okay.
I don't know that the material they used for that is on there. They just show a little black cement. Yeah, probably. I mean, I guess. But I have a construction diagram that I can show you and how that was sealed off.
Thank you very much, both Heather and Charlie. If there are other questions that come to mind after today, let's take the same method, let's get those consolidated and send those back to Tom, and Tom can help get those to Charlie and Ken, so that we can get a list of answered questions, everybody.
Just a quick, Charlie, the chemical that was put down there, was it basically Basin F liquid?
I think I believe. What happened with Basin F, just so everybody knows, it was a liquid waste disposal basin. It held, I think, 240 million gallons is total capacity, and it was used to evaporate liquid waste. And so over time, it became more concentrated. So the chemical analysis that we have when we incinerated it in the 90s, okay, is probably not exactly representative of the more dilute. There was a version of that waste that existed back in the 60s. Does that make sense?
It does, but so the underlying question though is, can you provide this committee with kind of a breakdown of the chemicals that were put down in that hole, so that as they're looking at this, they can look, if they're looking at monitoring, to see whether those chemicals are dispersing through the fracking process, they know it's monitored for?
Yeah, I can't give you anything precise. I can give you a general characterization of what the waste was. It was generally a high salt solution. It had metals, it had pesticides, and it had other organics to it. We do have different chemical analyses, but I don't know that it's exactly representative.
Would DIMP been a major part of the kind of waste that went down there, DIMP? Would that have been a major part of the waste that went down there? Would that be a marker?
I don't know that that's the case. It could be. I don't know that would be a major constituent.
Could you pass that kind of information back over to us so we can look at that?
I can certainly get you what we have.
Okay.
I don't want to say it's precise and disappoint you, but we have general characterization of the waste, but it may not get down to a compound. Obviously, Basin F was a source, and groundwater monitoring around that area, we picked up various contaminants. Okay, so we have groundwater analyses from that area, so you could, kind of put two and two together that some of those came from Basin F.
Well, the injection well was right by Basin F,
I'm
right?
so sorry. We're now at 40 minutes past, and I know there are a ton of questions. We've got a hard stop at 5.
Right.
So let's capture questions, and let's get them back. Charlie, I'm sure you'll be happy to get additional answers where you don't have them.
You bet. And all the way I ask is that I'm trying to put in perspective with respect to the oil and gas. There's a lot of questions about the arsenal, and I'd be glad to take as much time as anybody wants. But in relation as to whether it affects this particular issue at hand, I think there's some that are not directly related. And believe me, on a different forum, I'll take as much time as you want to educate folks about what happened at the arsenal. I think Sandy knows that. We've gone to her meetings quite a bit. And certainly a cleanup this complex, you can talk about a lot of different topics, but to bring it back to this particular issue, I'm not sure they all affect.
Well, I guess the huge question is there a possibility that fracking for oil on, near, around, and any proximity would open up new pathways? I mean, again, looking to that contamination, again, looking at it, again, we were trying to understand exactly, again, not coming from a scientific perspective, mind you, this extremely toxic chemical was pressurized, put into the ground, and it was assumed that it would just spread out and dissipate, correct? Or is it just going to, I mean, what was the assumption when you injected
It's
it?
injected at 12,000 feet.
Okay.
And there's nothing that would bring it back up.
It doesn't go through the whole, because I'm looking, I was researching the rock and the formations, and it seemed like it was very similar to shale, where it would be able to fissure up through or come up somehow from that location,
So
where
I
it
think
was
this is
injected.
actually a really good point to jump back to the next piece of the agenda, because I think that specific question we could potentially cover in a suggested discussion item in an upcoming meeting. And I think it ties to Geology 101. It's been a while since I've had high school or college geology.
Right.
And I think we can, in looking at what I've put together as a proposal of discussion progression, layer that into a subsequent item. So we take what we've learned from Charlie and Ken today, we do a geology component in an upcoming meeting, and give some additional consideration to what we know about what happened, how it happened, where it happened, facts about the geology in question in our area, and whether or not there could be a risk that is reasonably visible, reasonably present. So with that said, I want to be sensitive to the fact that we don't have a ton of time left. I think everyone was in agreement that we want to be as efficient and effective to cover the topics in hand over the coming meetings. With that said, I've put together this straw man of meetings. There's a potential that we could collapse the first few, so I'd like some input from the citizens. I'd like some input from our industry representatives. The idea here is to say, let's put a box around a specific discussion item, and the example here is, item 1 really is environment, encompassing of environment. So some additional baseline education for us. We've heard about some of the monitoring and toxicology type things today from Ken and Charlie. Do we do an entire session that really we bring in any remaining experts on toxicology 101, hazardous waste 101, baseline water sampling 101, and then the geology, so that we look at those things as a whole.
Will Charlie and Ken be at this?
They are standing invites to this meeting.
Okay.
We would need to identify who the appropriate folks to bring in, whether that's a geology professor from a local college or somebody from School of Mines, or if there's a recommendation, who that might be. And we really keep that meeting focused on consumption of information and maybe some Q&A relative to the activity based on what we know of the arsenal, et cetera. Steve?
What about wildlife? Because I know on the Colorado website, we show all the different species. We have bald eagles up there, golden bald eagles, and how that affects, and they're speaking of in those areas where there's eagles, you have potential one well, you can have more than one well in some sites, in some areas, you have 2 wells or 3 wells, and not to go out that range. So I would have some from the wildlife come in and speak there, because we have a lot of different species who roam through this prairie area here that has come up here. I mean, there's certain places in the mountains where they couldn't drill because of the wildlife.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair addition.
Just try to kind of pull this back to the issue at hand, which is the oil and gas well drilling. Is it, I think, be helpful, and I'm sorry I missed last week's or the week before, but the activity around that, okay, you have to look at the potential impacts of that activity, okay? Whether it's stuff that we've done out there, we look at the impacts of our work on wildlife because it's out there, okay? If you're looking at the well drilling activity, I can see concerns about the operation around that, but generally to impact wildlife, you need a pathway for their operations to affect wildlife. So if there's not a direct pathway, I don't know that it's necessary to spend a lot of time on that particular issue. That's my view of it. I mean, there may be wildlife impacts around that well drilling activity,
right?
But in terms of what's on the refuge,
they're not talking about the refuge. Not the arsenal, because this is a topic.
Okay, it's just
this is outside. Yeah, this is like outside
okay.
Different areas of the map that shows the wildlife area.
Can I suggest that we all take a look at this and then add our suggestions to
that'd be
it,
great.
rather than hashing it here and taking up time?
Yeah, I think, so I guess conceptually, we do one more round of sort of educational focused session, and then the subsequent meetings break down to a specific increment of the drilling process or the oil and gas process, if you will. So we learned last week in the presentation about the upfront permitting, well siting, all of those sort of upfront activities that stand up a well or recomplete a well. And there were some suggestions received on getting some further information on the permitting process itself, because we didn't touch on that in great detail last week, but we had comments offline about points in that process, different places that permitting or requests to do activity occur. And so we need to better understand what those milestones are. And so that was sort of one bucket. I think we get into more intense discussion when we get into the more active phases of the operation. So the actual drilling and completion or recompletion is, and again, this is my layman's interpretation of these milestones. So to the folks from industry, your forgiveness and your recommendations on how to better state this. But doing a meeting on well drilling, completion, recompletion, and in the context of that discussion, understand as best we can the intensity of those activities sort of in a general sense, and then how those scale based on the number of wells in a given square. I think that's sort of the terminology we were using last week. And then in that conversation, what are the air, water, noise, or other nuisance factors that directly relate to that phase of the game, so that we narrow our discussion in that regard. And then as an outcome of that discussion, whether during the meeting or as an outcome offline of that meeting, we identify factors that we want to put before COGCC for consideration from a rulemaking perspective, or things that we want to carry forward in our recommendations back to council. Changes to the land development code to impact noise or air or water around that phase of operations, and then continue a similar format as we get into the next phase, which we heard was fracture simulation, flow back, and well cleanup. And then the next phase, which is really sort of the operations phase of things. So now that the well is in place, the fracking is complete, what is sort of a day in the life, a month in the life of a well look like? What should we expect to see as a community, and what are those related impacts in that same vein, so that we really have this building block approach through the process. We keep the discussion bound, and we can then hand those items back to either COGCC or to our council. My hope is that we're going to find things in this process along the way that COGCC or COGA say, this makes great sense. We're open to it, we're going to act on it. And it'd be great to be able to see something checked off our list as we move along. Otherwise, we're going to end up with a complete list at the end, and those things will obviously be taken forward for consideration. The idea is to try and get this discussion structured, moving in some logical direction, get to a point of assessment that's roughly in line with this additional 30-day period, and we make a decision on where we go from there as a committee and recommend that to council. So throw it up to comments. Jody?
We will take this back to our group and discuss it with it. I mean, it seems like a good plan. My concern is we seem to have people coming in and with a lot of great information, but when we have the citizens, we're very mindful of that. We bring everybody together and say, this is what's going to be happening. What are your questions on the Rocky Mountain Arsenal? The last time, what are your questions on fracking? What do you want us to bring there? It seems like we're getting a lot of time for them to explain. It's great time, but we're not really getting to address any of the concerns of the issues. So I would suggest, as a matter of, the way that we're structuring the meetings, to potentially, maybe we start with us and we say, here's our concerns, here's what we want to say, here's what our citizens are worried about. Because I'm going to leave today and I'm going to feel like we really didn't get a chance to go through things that we very thoughtfully put together.
So on the questions, and I absolutely respect that. So on the point of questions, I believe we've had several rounds of questions now submitted. Tom, have we had answers now? Questions coming back?
I've sent in 2 batches and I've not heard anything back.
So to the folks here that have received those questions from industry, have you guys had a chance yet to weigh in on any answers to those questions yet? Because that's a question I have on my list as well, is the status of those responses, because we need to get the responses back to me to document that the questions were asked, the responses are in, and obviously dedicate time to that discussion.
Right, yes, we're working on the responses. There's a number of questions that were submitted.
Do we have any sense of, because what I want to do is sort of balance with Ms. Bacon is asking with obviously the need to get answers back. And as we heard last week, some of these are not simple one-liner answers, there's more to it. But in the spirit of this progress, we need to, making progress here, we need to get answers in hand to consider. So do we have a sense of what the time left to get at least a first cut on those responses back looks like?
Do I get back with our folks and try to get it as soon as possible? I'm really hesitant to commit to a certain time frame, but we'll do our best to get it by next week, if that would be appropriate.
I mean, if we can have it by next week, then I think we could consider.
That would be nice. Yeah, here's my other suggestion. It feels really rushed. It feels like I have to figure out what exactly I should prioritize, what my group wants to ask, and cut out everything else that I don't think is important. And I don't think that that's right that I do that. I think that we need to then slow down and say, okay, great presentation. Thank you for clarifying some of the issues. I've checked a couple of them off. But you know what? We need to ask our questions the next meeting in regard to the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. I mean,
what you're describing is exactly, I think, what we've talked about multiple times now, which is these meetings are for the presentation of information, asking of reasonably quick questions, and the collection of questions that need to be considered offline. And I think part of that is the consideration and reflection on those by all of us as participants. So in an ideal model, in my mind, you guys are collecting information, you're going back to your citizens, and you're discussing those to come back with a list of things that need to get further discussion.
Right.
And so I understand that there is a sense of pressure, and I think it's important that we have some sense of pressure. If we extend this out indefinitely, we're going to lose the active participation of many of those here. And so we may get to a point where there is still need for more, and we'll determine that then. But I would ask that and challenge us to work within that fairly tight cycle of activity.
Given that, can we then, on the next meeting, start with our questions? And can we address the questions from the meeting prior and to this meeting, and then the list of questions that have not been answered? Can we start with those to ensure that our citizens are being heard?
Could we get them a couple days prior? Because then if we come to the meeting and we go, oh, there's the answers, then we got to review them and go, okay, here's where we move from here. It's kind of hard to, or like Steve suggested, maybe make the meeting 2 weeks out. I don't know. But some way that we can have a couple days before the next meeting.
So, I guess to Andrew, do you have a point on the responses from industry, or is that a joint effort?
Yeah, I mean, many of the questions are relatively straightforward and be answered relatively quickly. Some of them are more broad and vague, so to those, I mean, provide general responses, but you wouldn't be cognizant of citizens' concerns.
So I think one of the things that the citizens offered last week was to provide additional narrative around their questions to help guide response. I think to Ms. Bacon's point, if there are questions that are amorphous and they're not easily answered, then we need to have that teed up for discussion. So I'm totally open to saying, and again, that's the purpose of the discussion here, is to say what should next meeting be and the subsequent meeting. If we think that in general, this is a logical progression of events, but the first thing we need to do is sort out the questions that we have outstanding, then so be it. If that's the will of the committee, then let's do it that way.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, also with the proposed agenda and the list of topics, some of these questions may very well be
slide into those.
Right, more appropriate for that presentation and for that expert who you bring in for that particular meeting.
Thoughts on aligning questions, and I think there was some limited discussion that day last week.
Well, I mean, our questions today, we're ready with our questions, with our perception of what happened in Direct Beyond Arsenal, and literally would have been a 15 or 20 minutes. Here's what we think. Here's what we have read. Here's what we're. Here's our questions. It would have been perfect today to pose those questions, having these gentlemen here, but we didn't get to that point. So now I feel like you have to.
And I guess I want to be very clear. And this is where we have to be openly communicating and trusting the members of this committee. We discussed an agenda as a committee last week and agreed to that agenda. There wasn't a specific request during that discussion to say we would like an allocation of time as a community to pose specific questions. It was more of a, we want to have experts come in and talk to us about the arsenal and that activity and be able to ask questions. So I apologize if there was any misunderstanding on my behalf, but I didn't get that in the discussion. So
can we assume that from now on, that we would at least have 15 minutes for the questions? I mean, you think that you're going to be able to interject the questions and somehow place them, but it doesn't happen that way. So.
Absolutely. I would also just say, let's get them documented, and let's hand them off so that we can at least get some folks reflecting on them, if that makes sense, and not hold them back waiting for a one-on-one discussion. If we can get starts to those responses and then flesh out anything that's not clear or additional commentary that's relevant, then how do we make the most of the limited time we have together and the most of the time that people may have outside of this meeting? And I don't want to dictate black and white how we do it. I'm proposing what I think seems to work best in some areas.
I know I understand the idea of getting the questions answered as we go along, but for me, they're stepping stones for more knowledge and more answers, more questions. And so when those presentations come along, I like to be able to ask those advanced questions, not the basic ones I have written down. So I like to get those down so when we go through the next presentation, we can say, okay, I got another one based on that.
So for the questions that we have to this point, is it possible that within a very short amount of time we get some indication back from you on which are very difficult to answer so that we can get them back to the citizens for additional consideration, and then where you feel like there's a clear opportunity to provide an update or an answer on that, and to get those at least 24 hours in advance of next week for folks to consider, ideally more if possible. I know that's a tight window. If it's not possible, please say so.
So that was our intention, was to answer these questions as quickly as possible, and we're in the process of working on this. And we'll do our best to have written responses to the concerns that we can address that relate to Commerce City and to the relative future developments.
And I appreciate that. I think the only other piece to just add to that is we've had a couple other items that were put forward, and I appreciate Greg for bringing the handout today. We had, I think it was 2 weeks ago, the discussion about the positions from industry and where interest exists, and that's an item that we haven't seen go forward yet. So, short of putting on my project management hat from work and literally building an action register that says, hey, you're on the list for this, I'm hoping that people are taking actions that they know that they own and bringing those back. But I'm happy to move to a point where we literally have a list of publicly logged items and who the owner is and where they sit and what their commit date is. But that adds a lot to the meeting to try and manage that component of it. So,
Jason, one element of that, of what I thought was relevant, very relevant to the arsenal, was the position of the Fish and Wildlife Service, either on the split estate within the arsenal that it would have to see drilling on, or its option to lease federal mineral estate, so that we can get this picture of cumulative impacts around the city. And I don't think Andrew's taking on the task to look at future position with respect to the federal estate on the arsenal. You're not taking, you're just taking private land.
I think that was an item that COG.
With respect to industry's position, that is their leasing ownership in and around Commerce City.
That's coming as a surprise to me. Yeah. That we took that on.
We need to pause on this, open it up for public comment, which we had to start 10 minutes ago. 1 minute, Steve. Hold your thought, please. Do we have any comments from anyone in attendance?
Yes, I would like to make a comment. I'm in total agreement with Jody. And, as far as saying, get this done as quickly, get answers as quickly, I don't care about quick. What I care about is very factual, accurate, precise answers to our very specific questions. And so far, we've had 3 of these. The first one I didn't attend because of reasons that I won't go into. This cannot be done quickly. And I don't know where you guys are getting it that this can be done quickly. It can't. You're talking about our city, our community, our families, our neighbors, and until you want to live next door to me, then you can give me quick answers. But until that time, no. I want everything that I've asked for. Accuracy, precision, and no waffling on the answers to the questions. That means that you don't talk in circles so technically that I can't understand what you're trying to say, so I sit here looking stupid because I don't want to ask another question because you never answered the question, and I don't even know what the question was to begin with. I don't want that to happen. Thank you.
Just to respond, our intention is to provide factual, precise answers to your questions, and in a way that's understandable to a non-technical person. That's our intention.
In a way, it's because I live here, okay? We've already suffered that here in the southern area where industry was just allowed to move in, and none of the citizens had a say-so in that. I don't want history to repeat itself. I don't want the North to match the South. Period. End of story.
That being said, would it make sense to extend the meetings to 3 hours and potentially look at, because the 2 hours is seeming very rushed. Maybe we need to do every 2 weeks and then do 3 hours, or maybe we need to do a couple 3 hours, at least plan for that.
I'm open to anything. I mean, again, we threw the ideas out last week on time of day, day of week, duration of meeting, and I've gotten a mixed perspective on how long folks are attentive. Like, I can tell you that oftentimes when you go past 2 hours, you lose people. If we have a commitment for folks to stay attentive during that period of time, then I'm open to that. I don't want this to seem rushed, but I do want to put forth a sense of urgency on this subject.
Why?
And
Why? What is the rush? What is the urgency?
This is not for debate, this is for public comment. So let's think about this as citizen communication. I'd be happy to talk to you
Okay,
offline.
my question is, what is the rush? That's my question.
In simple terms, we have an agreement with industry right now to stand down our activities in our city. We want to avoid, to the extent possible, needing to go and litigate. They don't want to find themselves in a position where they're litigating with us. We don't want to find ourselves in a position where we're litigating with them. If we're able to make forward progress on this without that occurring, I think that's to all of our best advantages. That said, and I made clear from the first meeting, which not everyone was present at, that this is a format that will evolve and adapt to the needs of the community. We find ourselves in a position where we are not getting the outcome that we need, we will reconsider that. We literally reconsider various elements of this on a meeting-by-meeting basis. At some point, we have to put some structure in place that doesn't create a simply open-ended format. Move through that, and if we find that there is a need to go back and do deeper dives in specific areas, then we need to do deeper dives in certain areas if that's what's necessary to inform our ultimate decision. Do we need to take a stab at one of these meetings and find that we don't have sufficient time to talk through the entire topic and say we need to extend out our agenda? Certainly that's an option for us. I'm not looking to put the agenda in stone, but I do want to put it in a manner that we have a logical sense of how it's going to progress so that industry, citizens, et cetera, can plan and think and consider questions for discussion and reflection in advance of the meetings. If we know that the plan is to talk about such and such on the 30th of the month, then we can be planning our personal homework and research in that same vein. So with that said, comments?
Mr. Congressman, one thing I would maybe suggest from an industry
Just a
point of
council
view-
member, and it's just Jason.
Sorry, thank you. But, you know, for a common goal of us wanting to educate the public and the public wanting to have an open forum on questions, has the thought been considered, you know, outside the scope of this project, because as its first meeting, I know where you want to go with this, maybe we set up with some of the industry representatives that are here, set up an open forum where we can have very calm, cool, collected conversations where, because we don't want to do that. That's not our goal. We don't want to talk too technical. We don't want to talk in circles. But you know, that would be a great place to have just an open forum to answer a bunch of basic questions. And then, you know, in here we can still build upon the other ones. And you know, from my perspective, I'd love to sit with each one of you one-on-one and discuss those things. But you know, maybe we can do that an open forum outside of this scope of this project, because I know where we want to go with this. But you know, our goal is not that. We do have people that live in these communities, and we're very, very cognizant of that as well. So.
And I appreciate that. And that was actually one of the things that we considered as a council, was doing an additional round of sort of public forum. I think what I get is a sense that before we move anywhere, we need to get the questions that have been posed to date as closed out as we can, and then consider the agenda beyond that. So with that said, I'll put the idea out there that we dedicate the whole of the next meeting to Q&A and follow up on questions posed to date. We use the end of that meeting to see how we feel about the information received at that point, and also between now and then give additional consideration to the order of meetings going forward so that we can determine if that's an appropriate way to proceed beyond the next meeting. Steve?
On that note there, I see, after a meeting on the 23rd, the 25th, we have the Ag Talk dinner on the 25th. And seeing how this is arranged, I would like to see if we can not have the January 25th meeting, start February 1st, and then have it, and just add the other meeting to March 5th, I think it is. March 7th. So instead of having the meeting on the 25th, do the 1st, 8th, 15th, 22nd, February 29th, and then March 7th.
Does that mean you wouldn't want a meeting next week to allow for industry to come back with answers to questions that have been collected to date?
We have a conflict.
I think we want to do that on the 1st, push that back. That gives kind of more time to answer the questions.
Yeah, and then Dan, because he said some things on that answer to Dan, but that way we can have a catch-up time. And then, we reflect from them.
We'll get our questions together from today and our comments and concerns and put those together as well. So.
To clarify, the questions from industry, the industry answer, are not the ones relating to Arsenal and the ones that the U.S. Army, representative from the U.S. Army Manager, is that?
And that's who Mr. Charlie represents.
Yeah, but just from today. They'll be here at the next, you'll be here at the next meeting, even though it's not next week, correct? Okay.
Because there's questions directed towards different entities, and I want to make sure this industry is not.
My sense is that if industry identifies a question that it feels it has an answer to, it would own that question and the response to it. If you're not the owner of the question, I wouldn't expect a response. So anything that's Army or not applicable or not, you're not in a position to provide an answer to, then I wouldn't expect anything like that.
I wouldn't mind if it was a drilling question, if the CGA, CGCC, and Anadarko and Hillport all took a stab at their own version of that answer and say, here's what we think, here's what we see. Because sometimes, different companies will see different views, so, it's a good perspective.
Yeah, and that was the expectation up front. So that's why I asked if you were taking point on responses on behalf of industry or answering independent of Halliburton, Anadarko, et cetera.
Well, I can coordinate with Anadarko and Halliburton and industry to provide industry-specific responses. Now, when you're talking about regulations and such, that's pure towards COGC.
Yes, and that would be my expectation as well. Yep.
Jason, I don't want to complicate it further, but I want to build on what Wes said. I think if you're going to talk about the arsenal, you have to invite Fish and Wildlife Services. It's an act of Congress to set up the refuge. This is no mean deal.
That's correct.
And there's a lot of money involved there, and they may take it very, very hard that you're going to turn it into an oil field.
I want to be very clear. I don't think any part of this discussion is centered on an expectation or an assumption that we're turning a refuge into a drilling activity. We're talking about the land's peripheral to the arsenal and potential impact to the arsenal of drilling peripheral to the arsenal. If we find out that there are potential drilling impacts on the arsenal, that's certainly another round of discussion that we would obviously want to have. But it's my understanding thus far, and Mr. Eager?
Well, Steve was invited to this meeting. He wasn't able to get back in town to the committee. He did provide some answers. I sent him emails tomorrow. We've asked him specific questions about would they allow drilling on the refuge for federal mineral rights. And there's 2 out parcels, or I think 3 out parcels, and what they would do. Part of that was communicated early on to council and the residents. We'll provide that information from Steve to this group.
So as part of, we have posted a handful of frequently asked questions, and one of them deals with mineral rights on the refuge, the arsenal. And I think Michelle's going to post those today or tomorrow. Another question was about the plume maps. I think she's going to post a copy of the plume map as well. So there's going to be some information on Commerce City's website that addresses some of those questions.
To get that to the plume map and the question about mineral rights on the arsenal will be on the city's website tomorrow.
Is there a state on it?
The plume and
I think those are going to come back in the queue because those questions were posed by staff.
the on-site plume, right.
Offsite.
Offsite.
First question was.
For the next meeting, can we move back to 5 o'clock Thursday? Is that working okay?
Yes.
I think this is difficult. I heard some email or message, like I said, offline about this today's
5
difficult.
Thursdays, is that?
So that would be February 2nd, I think.
Okay.
Is that work okay?
Groundhog Day.
We have a special council meeting on the 2nd of February.
A lot of people have said that.
Guys, sorry, if we can just have
That's, the CFP February 2nd, I was going to move it even later, like to 6 or 6:30, because there's a special council meeting.
So as you're saying, exactly.
Wednesday.
You want to keep it on February 1st? February 1st is better.
But it sounds like the late start time. Do we want to go with 5:30? Is this slightly softer start time? Sorry?
I personally can't, but
What's your preference?
is late, after 6 o'clock on Wednesday, 6 or later.
Can folks do 6 o'clock on Wednesday the 1st?
Can that one be a 3-hour one?
I'm open for that.
If we're doing a 3-hour one, can we do it earlier? 3 maybe?
Let's just do 2 hours.
So 2 hours at 6 p.m.
2 hours, 6 to 8.
February 1st.
Okay.
Nancy Ketchum on questions, is that what
We're going to
We'll
focus
start
the
off-
entire session on questions with the hope that we've gotten responses back from the appropriate answer or respondent from the questions that are out there. Should we put a deadline for any new questions that we want responses received for in advance of that meeting?
No, I don't think so, because we haven't been able to get
Let me just be clear, not that they won't be answered, but if we expect to have an answer by that meeting, we would expect to have them submitted by a certain point of the
Friday before, I think.
I'm sorry?
Friday before.
Is that sufficient?
Why not the next Wednesday, that would be the next meeting?
Still that knowledge, and then that way we come to the meeting able to stand on that knowledge.
All right, so the goal,
Thursday?
Wednesday.
That really gives us, 2 days to prepare.
let me read
formal answers.
Let me restate this and see if I think I've got it. We're not going to meet on the 25th. Any additional questions, let's try and get those submitted on the 25th so that Tom can get those distributed, consolidated and distributed, and that gives folks the week between then and the following meeting to get those answers assembled. We will then meet on the 1st at 6 p.m. for 2 hours.
Hoping to have the answers prior to the meeting on the 2nd, so we know. But not the Arsenal questions.
The meeting is on the 1st, not the 2nd. We will add the clarification that for any questions that are completed before then, it would be great to get those distributed before then, as early as we possibly can. Is that fair?
Okay, it's just, like I said, I submitted some last week and we forfeited.
And that's the whole, yeah, just to be clear, that's the whole purpose of next meeting and what we're trying to get cleaned up right now. So very sensitive to that. And I know you're well past your hard stop at 5. So we'll see everybody on the 1st at 6 p.m.
Questions have to be in
Do
by
we
the
believe we'll be
25th.
in the chambers on that night? So we'll be back in the main chambers. Get your questions in by the 25th. And we'll hope for answers at least a couple days before the meeting.
And then we sooner than Thursday, we're going to Thursdays at 5 after that? Or we don't
No, we'll determine. Thank you, guys.